继续 Braid 时空幻境的周年重制版，我都不知道这个 design 的部分什么时候会结束。对，45秒。来，Mark Ten Bosch 还差一点点吗？这个都看过了。Mark Ten Bosch，右边结束了是吧？并没有，这里还需要往上过去。这边结束了，稍微需要把这个音量往下调一下。OK， 来。Shit！ 哎呀，这么难吗？这样的话，这时间差是不是又拉大了？哇，好快呀！看到里面都在。总算上来了，这看过了啊。Why is there HD for the boss monster？ 这还有这么一朵云 ，Clouds and Math。哎，这个还有 Math 吗？啊，我懂了，他的意思可能是那个之前的什么数学的计算公式。Movement amplifier 应该是这个。
And so, related to the movement code, I
Code
know you said in one of your talks that
啊，
you
这
had
个
to solve a partial
紧
differential
张，就
equation
differential
to know something about the movement there,
真的假的
Yeah, I don't know if it's a PDE. Like my differential equations are not,
？PDE
or
but
some
it's
sort of
the
differential
discrete.
equation.
So I did the discrete version,
Maybe not
which is
partial. Yeah.
a convergence series, right?
Right.
紧张。
Yeah, that's when you're riding on clouds that are moving.
Yeah, that's what I thought it was. Yeah. And so, the question I have about that is, was it scary that you might not be able to solve this
Yeah,
case?
it wasn't that scary because it's not like the whole game resides on whether this is mathematically true or not. It's just better if it is, right? Because players aren't going to know either way.
And you could have cut that part, you think? Or
嗯
if it didn't work at all? Or...
Yeah, I would have cut it if it didn't work. At first, okay, like I think I solved the equation wrong at first anyway, and I thought it converged for some speeds and then diverged for other speeds. And so I was going to make something out of that where you have clouds that go faster. I was like, how do I do this in the game? Maybe there's clouds that go faster and faster until you get
Mm,
on one and like it throws you off the level, or who even knows,
mhm.
right? I didn't get that far.
And you were interested in this probably just because it looked cool, or just there was something about,
Well, it's another consequence that you have to explore.
yeah.
Like, look, if time moves based on your position, well, one of the things you can do in this game is ride on things. So you have to define that anyway, right?
Mm,
If we don't have you ride on something in this world, that's weak sauce, first of
mm,
all. So then what happens? You could imagine a few things that happen. So you could imagine I get on the platform. Because the platform has speed moving to the right, I'm moving to the right, therefore time goes forward because I'm on the platform, right? And then maybe if I run left, depending on the speed of the platform, maybe I can get closer to time stopping or something. That could be a little interesting, but it seemed very limited to me. Like you could do maybe a few puzzles about, the platform goes at like exactly walking speed. So if you run left, time stops, but only because you're still running off the platform. But I guess you would have to get up to acceleration because I guess the platform would stop moving. It's weird. You need to sort of define like, is there a feedback loop there or not? I thought about that for a little bit and I didn't like it because it just made it more like the rest of the game. So yeah, it's kind of interesting that I have a little bit more of an analog speed control over the rate at which time happens. But that's not even that interesting because the same things are still happening. It's like they're happening a little slower, they're happening a little faster. We have that in World 6. So you end up re implementing the same effect in a different way, which none of that seemed very good to me. I like the thing about World 4, the way it feels is it's still, right? It's like kind of frozen until you move. And I felt like there was going to be enough to do with that, that should just be the way that it works, is that it really is whether you are moving. But now, okay, does that mean when you're moving you should ignore platform speeds? That would result in like physics that is pretty different from the rest of the game because platforms don't slip out from under you in the game, right? And so I ended up with this balance where it's like, okay, time moves based on movement initiated by you, right? But that is momentum movement influenced by what you're riding on and stuff. And that seems to work well for that level, but it is by no means the only way it could have been executed, right?
这里搞了个这么个 tease。The end game. There are no rabbits in the end game. 哦，还真是。哦，end game.
So now I'm going sort of back to more general questions. And what's interesting, I think, is when you make a game like that, you have all these elements. Like you have the cannons, the rabbits, the flowers, and it's sort of this big tapestry that needs to like everything needs to be used more than once and it has to make sense, but it still needs to be like there's a reason why you made it up in the first place, and that probably is stronger than the reason why you're trying to reuse it. Like it always feels like you're stretching the material to like catch other things, but there's this whole big structure that you're trying to build, and I was wondering if you had any trouble with parts of that. It's a very general question, but maybe that brings something to mind.
With figuring out what the base elements were or with
Yeah.
stretching the elements?
Like you were like, okay, like this is not used, so I should try to reuse it more.
I mean, the thing that we just mentioned about World 1 is a little bit of that, where it's like, it just turns out a lot of these things are not useful in World 1, and so ideally I might have somehow started with different things.
Right, yeah.
Although most of the things that I think about maybe don't matter that much. So that's, I mean, I do think like the bunny rabbits they're a little bit, it's a weird thing because I wouldn't want to delete them from the game because then maybe there isn't enough stuff after that. Like again, they came from like I want a harder enemy that you're more scared of or whatever, right? And that's fine, but it's not really what the game's about. It came from this early time, like okay. So on the one hand, I did know that this game was about I'm stuff and that I wanted to be focused on that, but I still like was having fun making a game and got excited about non-time stuff like oh there's going to be a boss with a big gun who like shoots it or I need a more complicated enemy. Isn't it funny if it's kind of like the bunny rabbit from Monty Python and the Holy Grail? But we're not going to just like clone that. But like it's just a little bit funny to do to call back to that in some very vague way, right? So that's kind of what that is. And it's like it's not actually super deep, but it was good enough to build the game with. And then once I built the game, I'm like, well, I don't know how to replace that with something better, right? So it is what it is. And I think pretty much every game is like that. Every game that I've ever done was like that, where you make decisions early on and those just shape what the thing is in the end. And then by the time you're in a place to maybe question those decisions, it is too late in terms of the thing that you've explored. Like that stone is in the foundation of the thing that you built. And you can't do a lot about it. Except try again next time now that you're a better designer, right?
Next time. The end game. 哦，这居然还能再往前？
So now I'm going to
哦，这里那也是。
Came early back.
怎么反过来？从右往左？
Stone is now that you're a better designer, right?
对啊，这怎么从右往左啊？梯子从这儿上来，这为什么反过来？
Time is bidirectional, right?
这没
This is
看过
one。of the things that survived sort of from the original set of ideas about quantum mechanics and relativity, because one of the things we see in physics at all levels, actually, even in like Newtonian physics, the laws of
Newtonian
physics
physics.
are bidirectional with respect to time. Like the only reason that time seems to go more strongly in one direction is like friction and inertia and stuff. It's like a statistic. What is friction? It's like statistical collisions working out a certain way. The beginning of time is a low entropy state, and the end of time is a high entropy state. And it looks to us while we're inside that like it's just things happening, and then you get more entropy out. But if you like were to stand way back and look at the whole thing, it's like a very simple shape, right? So then when you get into quantum mechanics, it's a little more complicated. But there's this thing called CPT conservation.
CPT.
Where, you know, the product of these things, it's charge, parity, and direction of time, right? So if you reverse time, if you negate the charge, something like that. But like there's a way that it works out, and it's invariant.
Right. So you
way.
flip one, and then the other is flipped.
Yeah.
Because, yeah. Okay.
Anyway, how if I was going to write fiction about time going backwards and forwards at the same time? That's not that hard. And in fact, if you make it, as we found out since then, you can make a quite high budget movie where you just sort of show stuff going both directions. But like, okay, it was an interesting challenge. How do you actually make that happen like for real? What even does that mean? And at first I was like, okay, obviously I could like either have some things simulate backwards or record some gameplay and play it backwards, but you really want the two streams to affect each other. Right? And that's one way, and that's the levels leading up. And then after that, it's like, okay, how do we use this in the story? How do we do something cool for the ending? And like, how do we use this directionality of time thematically for real? Right? As opposed to just saying in the story that things going backwards has some meaning.
Yeah,
right?
Right.
And that's where that came from. It was just how do I make a good world out of this? And then I guess when I had that idea for the ending scene, that's when I knew that was the last world of the game, right? I knew it was probably one of the later ones because I had the earlier ones figured out, but I was like, okay, that's a good ending, and there we go. And I was pretty hyped because there was basically 1 week where I had the idea. I sat down and programmed it. It basically worked. And then I sent it to one friend, and he played it, and he was like, yeah, this is cool, right? So there was like a week and a half of like end to end from idea to completely working thing. And it didn't change that much into the final game. It got a little bit bigger with more details. There's more like intermediate things that happen in that level, but it was basically the same idea.
这个可能看过了。
So then World 1 is pretty easy. It's kind of like given to you almost.
哦，好像看过
Are。you okay with
Don't do that. Or that to me is
what it was? Or
what can I do with this? There's the button go backward.
哎，对，
It goes backward. You at a certain. It's the princess. When it's scripted like that, maybe there's something cool. Too hard of an entry.
最后一段再来
Just a little. I can go. Okay. And I actually found myself quite limited getting to this point in terms of like what could I actually do? Maybe there's something cool that I didn't think of. It's quite possible, but I was like, okay, this is enough. Like I think if you jump straight into the finale level, that's a little too hard of an entry. So like here, we've got a little bit of an intro. Get used to things going backwards. Isn't that interesting? Is a world in its own right. And then there we go.
Ah, the end game. And then there we go. Should we help the player get closer to the solution? An alternative design for the high jump puzzle. 这没看过吗 ？The hardest puzzle in the game. 那看来就是那个哪个来着？那关了，需要 speed run 那关 ，crossing the gap。啊，三个，这3个肯定不可能全没看过。Damn. 刷出来的速度很快。
all right. So next world, World 5. I think I
我觉得我看
remember
过了。
that's the one that I got to discover.
Dude, who game ending? That's probably my up. And they're like here and so the one
再看一下啊
or whatever.
这关键是你看过的东西还是不太明确。
in the right way, and I need them to do about.
And that's why it's one of my favorite puzzles in the game, if not my favorite.
等一下あ。まあこれはさすがに看过了。
What do you think of the
六
idea
分38
of making it more obvious that it's about a monster jumping on your head? Like maybe, yeah.
No, I don't like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I can say a couple things to start that I'm sure you've heard me say, but then maybe we can get into something interesting
Yeah.
new, right? So, firstly, a puzzle is something you might not solve, right? So, like, that's what makes it a challenge, is because if I don't do a good job, I won't be able to solve the puzzle, right? And some people take this attitude. Like, I hate puzzle games where, like, 10 seconds after you enter the level, it says, oh, you haven't gone that far yet. Let me give you a hint. Like, those timers are always set so short whenever people do that. It drives me nuts, right? I have heard specifically the rationale that we want everybody to be able to finish the game and solve all the main, and maybe there's some hard puzzles off to the side, but we want everybody to finish this game. And to me, that's not really a puzzle game anymore, because the depth of appreciation depends on how hard you actually thought about it, or how much, let's not even use the word hard, like how deeply did you think about what's happening in this level? How much did you run through permutations in your mind about what could be interesting about it? Then you come out of it with an appreciation. And the more that you just see the answer and do it, the less that happened, right? And so, well, okay, to get back to your actual question, I just like the magic that I see in that puzzle. And part of the magic, like I said, is from going from this is impossible to I see how to do this. If I tell you how it's possible, not even how to do it, but if I say, oh, this, imagine the little dinosaur showed up and said, try to get the monster to bounce off your head, right? That's the
Dinosaur.
stupid version of it. I could put a sign saying, beware of falling
这个
monsters
还真看过。
or something, right?
Can I just stop you?
I know
the
you
bad
wouldn't do this.
solutions.
You
对，
wouldn't
这
do
看
that,
过
but
了。
I'm
kind of gives you a
这东西
game that
问题就在这儿呢，你根本不知道什么时候
and we don't have that
什么
many
时候
other
看过，
ways
什么时
to
候没看
require
过，
a monster to be somewhere
到后面你已
that
经
was
乱
not
套了，因为
actually
数量实在
placed
太
somewhere
多了。
or anything.
这地方设计还是欠妥。那个东西其实看过了，那唯一没看过的可能中间这个估计也看过。
All right, so something you can have them jump
By we had monsters bounce on your head before that, right? And there's a platform pretty high because it's see everything
对，
there
这个
is
是
to
看
see
过的。
here, and it possible the game from scratch. Also a good fall down, and so the platform get over on the right. And almost could get there, but much stronger.
Like maybe that would have just been better, is if you go into this room and there's just a really high platform and that's it. Well, I mean, there has to be more. There has to be monsters coming out of a cannon that, you know, fall some distance somewhere. But that might have been a better level, actually. Like, I do generally try to frame things that are related on the same level. That happens a lot, obviously. Sometimes it's harder to tell why things are related if you're not me. In this particular one, it's like about the monster falling, right? It's like in the one, so monster comes out of a cannon. To solve one of the puzzle, you actually have to prevent him from falling by like filling both halves of a gap, right? Or you don't have to exactly do that, but that's the easiest way to do it. So you want him to not fall, but then you do want him to like fall, or I mean, it's in a different place, so it's not that clear. Like if he actually fell through that gap, again, that might be a better level. Okay, there's different things to go for. If I were going for just the absolute magic moment, it might be putting, as mentioned, the big jump on its own level. Although, like the thing with covering the platform or covering the gap with a platform is a little bit magical. It's like not as strong. But so maybe they should both be on the same level. But you could imagine changing it so that you emphasize the duality instead of like, I want it to be in the player's mind clearly that I want the monster to not fall, but I want the monster to fall for a different thing. And then the level would sort of be focused around that pit. One thing I will say about that level is it is kind of complicated for what it is. There's like just some little walls and whatever, and it probably could be simpler.
Ah, 这个是这样什么？这个嘛，可能啊，見たことあるね。再探索一圈的话，估计要绕一大圈了。这个地方的设计还是ちょっといかれてる呢。能回去吗？右边那个地方还能再过去呢。这种设计呢，有点像在写论文，这 cross reference， 但是对于游戏的这个来说，非常的不友好，可以讲。
Right, so those are some old.
Right? Like, think that's these are tell you maybe that's also a good monster is healing over it. The monster for that is
你
a
不
much
想错
weaker
过任何一个
foe,
东西，但是你
right?
又不是很确
Whereas
定
this。is much
有些人我还有
stronger.
印象
It's，just like
好几期前就几个小时前的，这真
and I don't know what I'm supposed
不
to
太
do
可
about it.
能。
And that's why it's one of
完
my
全
favorite
记
puzzles
得
in
住
the game, if not my favorite.
这个应该是看过的，就只有这个是没看过，中间这个确实没看
You
过。
know, there's not pressure plates even. Again,
这个6分38绝对看过。
of like in this
Like,
monsters and said
what do you think of the idea?
you might not. People take the hint like that. That's not really deeply did you. And the more magic that if I monster to bounce
And fitness, you do all these
I
things.
came up with. But if some point
Can I
it's a
stop you?
visual
这个
short- you
绝
can
对是
design
看
it
过
falls down in the pit, little cubby holes, and he gets a key out.
啊，卡比后，
It would be more like to do, which makes it not as good. Which one of the right of like observing
Transcending,
something just really far away off in some part of the universe. This world 5, and more Earth-like, more solving the harder. Okay, you went off to some mild, but if a minute ago, if it's too easy, then maybe it's not good because your mind didn't engage with it.
さあ继续去。捏巴里斯了，打没打了？从哪走呢？这个需要跳，那个地方也需要跳。啊，这好麻烦，这个相当麻烦。这个应该能搞定嘛？这部分这是应该能搞
These
定
are excerpts from an interview by Mark Tenbosch. Mark has been a friend of mine for quite a number of years now. I met him when he first started working on his four-dimensional game Miegakure, which he is still
Miegakure.
working on. He's one of the few people
其实
who
你妈
really
是日语。
understands the kind of design that I do at a deep level, so it was an interesting conversation.
这个游戏还有点意思，只是到现在为止还在开发。上完细节说说我已经查过了。Miegakure 主要是一个4D 的游戏，这个4D 不是说是现实中3维世界加上时间的4D，它是真正的空间的4D。所以说，如果你算上时间的话，就是5D 了。就简单的说的话，比如说我现在这个平台上分成3格，这个下面出来，但这么一个理念，3格对吧？每一格如果我点一个键就能进到一个世界，这样的话每一个世界是不是就是3D 了？就是一个3维了，然后再加上这个地方线性的1维，那就是4维了。所以是把3维放到一个另外一个世界里面，你每点进一个东西都是一个3维，所以这个想法是特别有趣的。就由下面出来，Miegakure The early design for puzzle 啊，这肯定
So I'm
看。
thinking of like monster there, get the It's an interesting. It doesn't seem like monster walks fast enough that accidentally, which is a hallmark of a good puzzle, and the rewind helps you with that.
Why is the story text like that? 我操！
What ended up in the game is then sort of these panels of text, which are very much like Einstein's dream in my mind, where it's trying to do a metaphor for what the mechanic is about, and then the gameplay, which is very mechanical and like doesn't really connect to the metaphor directly. So like those two elements feel a little bit disconnected to me, but also like you sort of explain how that came about. So I'm interested if you have anything more to say about that.
I mean, it's complicated, right?
Yeah.
Like, I definitely knew that some people weren't going to care about the fiction part of the game. because especially when you make a 2D platformer, you have some idea of. I just could very easily imagine
Somebody not want
to read the
to
story, and in fact, that was
I
very
see.
clear.
根本就
And
不想
actually,
看故事。
in the original prototype, the story parts they were just like on a screen, like introducing World 2. Here's a giant page of text.
Right.
Press spacebar
To continue.
And that you could especially see people start reading it and then go like skip, I want to
Yeah.
play the game, which is what I would do with most games
Right,
today
yeah.
as well. Unless like I have to, if I sit down in front of a game and it starts doing story stuff, really like what I'm seeing in order to stay with it, because otherwise I don't have faith that this thing is going to be any good, and I just let me get to the part where I get to do something, right? But so the way that I squared that a little bit, I was like, I want the story things to be a little bit more interactive, but I do want them to be together and coherent as a story segment. Like one thing you could imagine is that instead of being front-loaded story in front of each world like this, like Cave Story had been out for a long time, right? And that just, you meet characters over the course of this linear platformer and they tell you things, and those things come together to make the narrative, right? It's like AAA games did for a long time, but it's like the indie version of that. And that could have been the model for this, but it just wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to very straightforwardly be influenced by books. And one of the things about books, as different from some other things, especially the way games adopt them, is that books kind of want you to have an attention span, right? Because it's this long sequence of text. And I don't know if I ever explicitly had that as a mission statement, but I definitely felt that way. It's like, look, if you want to have an attention span and read this, that's fine. If you don't, I'm going to set it up so that it's in pieces and you could just sort of run by all the pieces, you know? But like I could have, you know, in those little book stands that are in the game, those could have just been scattered throughout the worlds, and you could have encountered them as you could. That would be a very easy change. But then it would be harder to get the coherent picture of them put together, which might have been good in some ways, because I did like this idea of an activity of trying to put together the ideas of the story and what is going on. But I just really wanted it to be front-loaded that way, you know?
I think it is nice that you have those two separate pieces and they sort of like bounce off each other, which you wouldn't get if you...
It's definitely a thing that some people complain about, but, you know, you can't listen to everybody's complaints, right? So
Yeah, you have to decide something.
that's like I could have done it, but it would have been a fairly different game, you know, if we and what would that decision have been based on, right? Like I kind of have a fear that, maybe a realistic fear, that a lot of players will not want to read something, so let me design for that. It's like, okay, but like maybe it's not that experimental of a game in that dimension anymore. Like I wanted to do this thing that I hadn't seen games do.
这个有难度啊。行。Why are the levels so geometrically simple? So geometrically simple.
All right, so the thing that struck me the most when I played Braid was how minimalistic the puzzle design felt. And I think that was like sort of the thing that blew me away the most, maybe, I want to say. And I was wondering if you had more thoughts on that. I've sort of heard you talk about it a little bit, but maybe we can go deeper there.
That's a direction that I went more in over time, that I kind of discovered while I was working on the game. There definitely was more complex level geometry in the beginning and more monsters and stuff. I think one idea that I had early on was I want levels to fit on one screen so that they're framed, like whenever possible. Like sometimes it'll be fun to have bigger levels, but if everything fits on one screen and you're thinking about a hard puzzle, you can see all the elements right there, and you're taking away some artificial difficulty and you get to the essence of the puzzle, right? Good puzzles are going to be things where you can see all the information, and that means they're not that complicated. And I had played puzzle games where the reason the puzzle was hard is because you have to do 17 things in the right order or whatever. And I was like, no, that's not this game, because this game should be about time. Because I'd been doing experimental gameplay workshop, I had this idea that every puzzle should be on theme for the particular world. And so if something is on theme, how complicated can it be? Because if there's some specific idea about it, if that idea only takes place in one part of the puzzle, what's the rest of the puzzle doing? It's kind of dead weight on that. Unless the idea happens multiple times to like fill out, but that's hard. It's like a lot harder to design one idea taking place in multiple ways. We actually do that on the new game a little bit, and actually Zach is really good at that. He's maybe the best person I've ever seen at that particular thing. So I think that gravitated towards simpler puzzles, but also just sometimes I would be working on a puzzle and I would be unhappy with it because it looks ugly, or just this thing is weird, and then I would delete the thing that was weird and I would like it more. And I kept seeing that trend. I was like, okay, this game is better when I'm more minimal. But that was only something that I really had clarity about, I would say, by the middle or 2/3 of the way through development, for sure.
Geometrically simple 啊 ，simple 不是坏事儿。有些人明明灰了，应该确定的灰了，有些明明看过了，为什么没有灰呢？很奇怪。Why are there 啊？对，有道理。之前你不是同样一个区域，从不同的地方进去就能看到不同的这个对话框了？对，有这么一个问题。照理说那个对话框就在那边，但是你通过不同的入口进去看到的是不一样。这个就是问题。Why are there interactive puzzle pieces and elaboration? The Cloud Bridge 这肯定看过了。
Is there more to say about why there is a puzzle?
啊，这看过。
As you like your, but then if you it could, I can attach have a different and a little would go. You have to earn it a little bit.
我觉得我这方面的记忆已经不算太弱了，但还是不太完全记得住。这个是肯定看过的，记住。
But I just never did that.
The pattern breaking thing.
Yeah.
对，这个是 pattern break。那讲 why there is a puzzle thing。然后刚刚那个梯子图一旦出来，我就反应过来，右边是不是还有东西？这里可能看不到，这个就不清楚了，看一下。
I don't feel that the explanation I gave Mark about why there are puzzle pieces in the game was very easy.
Yeah, 这个应该没看过。
So I'll try to clarify.
对 ，clarify elaboration 来。
As a baseline, there could have just been a counter. Each time you solve a puzzle, you get a star or something that then disappears and no longer exists except as a number. And when that number gets to 12, you've finished that world. But when I imagined the game working this way, it made the puzzles feel more arbitrary, in my estimation.
Okay.
I wanted puzzles to feel grounded and interesting and important, like you're working towards something other than just raising a number. Making the collectibles into puzzle pieces gives the player a new activity to do, on which he can make partial progress between puzzles. And this isn't just busy work, because the puzzle image communicates something. And each time the player connects another piece, he gradually figures out what the image is showing.
Okay.
And that's interesting. But the image isn't just random information. It refers to the subject matter in the story screens and the overall thematics of the game. So having you collect physical puzzle pieces also connects the puzzle gameplay to the story in a way it wouldn't otherwise be. The ladders to the attic are a similar idea. It could just be a number, and when the number gets to 5,
you reach
the
there.
end game. But I felt it was important to instantiate that number physically in the game, even though the ladders are not as rich or interesting as the puzzle pieces. They really can't be, because there are so few.
OK。这个看这什么 ？The Pit and the Magic Key。你确定这没看过？你确定这没看过？
You know, one of the levels that shows up again. In the game a few times
is the Pit.
Is this level called the Pit?
Yeah, I was going to ask.
And it's super. It's one of the most minimal. It's literally
it's
one screen.
Yeah.
And there's a pit. And then what can we do with
and
that?
And it happens
right?
like 5 times too, which is great.
Yeah. And so that in the original prototype of the game, that was the level where I introduced the magic key. And the magic key
就不会 rewind.
Was the predecessor to the current World 3 stuff we were talking about, where things don't rewind. But the idea back then was like, okay, the key doesn't rewind. It's just like special.
Just
so there was no sparkles. It wasn't like a modifier on objects the way that it is now. It simply was, the key is kind of cool. And I was like, okay, what's a simple way that you demonstrate that to people? Well, I want to force them to figure it out and have this epiphany from figuring it out. What if they have to go into a pit and get the key, and the pit is a little higher than they can jump? So maybe they think that they could jump out, but you jump in and then you're just stuck, and then you basically have to rewind out. And then, if you go and you look at this level, it was a very long level that totally doesn't fit on the screen, and you go to the right for a while, you jump on some monsters or whatever, and then I was following game design advice, traditional good game design advice, which is before you find a key, you must encounter the locked door and not be able to proceed.
Okay.
Because otherwise you don't appreciate the key. Otherwise you just get the key.
Of course, right.
Now I have violated that rule, sort of, in the final game, because you have the pit and then the gate on the other side, and you get the key first, or you encounter the key first, but because it's 2D and it all fits on one screen, you see the gate and it's kind of fine, right?
Well, yeah. Well, I think what it's saying is you should frustrate the player first, so that they appreciate it. Which doesn't mean they have to see it. They just have to feel frustrated.
I don't know if it's about frustrated even, but it's like if you get a key and then you see a locked door that looks like a really badass locked door, but you just have the key, you don't even maybe realize when you picked it up.
Right. Yeah. That's sort of
then
what
it's
I
like
mean,
a nothing burger, and nothing burgers feel bad.
Yeah.
Right. So it's about avoiding that
Right.
kind of a thing.
Which you've succeeded at that, right? Because you
Yeah.
fall into the pit and then you don't know what to do, and then therefore that's the part where you're like, oh, I need to be doing something. Something needs to happen. It's just not given to you.
Yes. But to go back to the original level, it was, so you would go left to right along the ground, right? You would run into this gate and you're blocked. So you climb up this trellis and like back left, and then over here there's like a pit, and it didn't fit vertically, so it was like kind of half scrolled off the screen. And then you would go into this pit over here and be stuck and come back out and come down and around. It was way less elegant. It was ugly.
看到这儿，我突然觉得这个好像也是看过
Like mechanically, I could have shipped that level, right? But I turned that level into the absolute minimum thing that you see.
就有感觉好像看过，但又感觉没看过。
What is actually good about this, right? And then what do I really need to do that thing that's good? And then also, I had just some idea of, hey, it's really cool to do things with the minimum amount, right? That's sort of an Eastern aesthetic.
Eastern aesthetic 倒没听过，
There's some Western traditions that do this too, but
这个
like,
还真
what,
没听过。
can I do something highly effective with a minimum amount of material, right? And it's a game design application of that.
就类似的
And then
观
once I
点
did
可
that
能
a
听
few
过。
times, I saw that it was working, I guess.
Is it a programmer thing as well, or like, do you think it's sort of your programmer part, like liking elegance in design, like minimum code for what it's doing, things like
Things
that?
like
It's quite
that.
possible. I mean, I didn't have that association in my head very deliberately at the time, but
Yeah, of course.
it could be just that I trained myself that way to appreciate that.
OK，
Okay, that's interesting.
Now it's weird because so
It's
the
weird.
aesthetics of the game visually are not minimal, right? Like the style, the painterly style of the game is very much not minimal. So it's not like I'm saying minimalism in all places is the right thing, but it's complicated. Right?
Well, I think, yeah, I don't think minimalism is always the right thing or not. I mean, it's just an aesthetic that you can decide to pick, and you're like, okay, I'm going to go for minimalism, and that's what the game is going to be about. And then there are going to be some good things and some bad things that come out of that.
Yeah.
right。最后看这个，先看这个。等等，底下有一个，上来是吗？我操，这还需要这种动作 ？Deliberate positioning of keys, making the obvious thing wrong. 啊 ，irreversible 啊
And I thought that puzzle just
Can say don't really.
So it was fun.
It's not even both. Then yes, it's like I've seen it. I'm like, okay, I want to
Why?
do this.
Why do you want to do that?
what?
Because it was
Because
fun.
it's funny.
知道，我想我看过这种东西。
And so
这个肯定看过。
And that
美赛里再确认一下侦探反
right now, and I should be more aware. Like it brings you back,
，which is good。
which is good.
OK。A strange grace note in Faith， 这个应该没看过。
So World 6 is the problem that I have is that it's again like I think it's all very
这个应该没看过。
clean design, so I don't
have anything to say
about it.
Yeah, fine.
There's one tiny thing where like it's sort of related where you put the flower where you're supposed to put the ring.
I mean, so that whole puzzle is more messy than I would like. So in a game like that where things move continuously, then making a puzzle clean is kind of about avoiding proximity between wrong solutions and right solutions in terms of like how close they get you to the goal. A dumb example is if you're not supposed to be able to jump across a gap, that gap should be really wide, right?
Right.
So that you don't think that that's what you're supposed to be trying to do. In this particular puzzle, it was really hard to get it to feel clean, actually. A related but different puzzle is the one we talked about with putting the ring on the cannon.
Right.
That one is cleaner because there's kind of nowhere else to put it. In this one we're talking about, you could put the ring on the ground.
这个能
It
做到吗？
does affect you, but not quite enough.
对的，是
It's
做不到
less clear that it's failure, I guess. And maybe that's why, really, okay, the real reason why I
那朵花
is, like, I don't expect people to actively use that as a
这个就是
hint to
hint。
solve the puzzle unless they have some weird intuition moment.
我当时就觉得是
Really what
hint。
it was is, after you solve it, it's a little bit cute that like, oh, that
If you know it,
flower
you
is
know it.
there as a thing of where I should put this. But also, it's a little bit cute because that flower is in the earlier version of the level. Because this is a reprise of a World 3, and that has the flower as well, and you don't really know why at the time. And it's for this, moderately tenuous, but definitely there's a point to it reason that happens way later in the game, and I just like that. It's not very logical. It's not even necessarily very playable, but it's just a thing that's there.
It's again interesting to contrast that in this case you were okay with helping the player.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is in part because I felt that it's a little messy. Like I just remember there being a lot of adjustment to like get the timing good. I mean, I could have put more gaps that you jump over or something, but I opted for simplicity in the end.
You could have like a granulated thing too, where like there's pits that you could put it in, so like it discretizes the locations.
Yeah, I guess I just felt like that was too complicated and ugly, right? Although, the judgment of how ugly things is, often in design we're making that based on the mock-up level, and then when you do like the final graphics, it could get a fiction to it and a visual pleasantness that makes you not mind it so much.
Okay. 아，从这儿走过来就行。The law of physics are bi-directional 啊，这个是那个哦。
Time is by like say back unique out since
这为什么要重复呢？
and that's and there we go.
就完全可以就一个对话只能在一个地方看到，就是因为这个 cross reference 同一个对话你能在不同地方看到，所以很乱。对，这个东西其实看过了，
It goes backwards.
这是刚刚可能也重新看过了，但之前就应该已经看过了。
What could I? That's a little too hard of an entry. So like here, we've got a little bit of an intro. Get used to things going backwards. Isn't that interesting? Is a world in its own right. And then there we go.
And then there we go. OK， 这样的话这个部分结束了。Mark ten Bosch 也算结束了。这个名字应该是个德文名 ，Bosch。Casey Muratori。
These are excerpts from an interview by Casey Muratori, who I first met back in the
Muratori.
1990s, and who was one of the early playtesters of Braid.
啊，
And,
这样。
as you'll hear in the interview, Casey was responsible for a substantial portion of the original ideas that inspired this game.
这样吗？是念 Casey Muratori
These are excerpts from an interview by Casey Muratori, who I first
啊 Muratori 不是穆拉托利。啊，这儿开始 story screen 了是吧？我操，这么多 ，damn！妈，从右往左，先看看这期大概能看多少东西。If you know it, you know it。这个是男人已经最后了是吧？Holy shit！我操！啊，这个是最后。靠，你这过得去？啊，这怎么可能过去？也没有别的东西能用啊。Why the jumps are not very high？ 这肯定看过了。这怎么可能做得到啊？讲道理，我觉得那儿都上不去，这么慢的吗？shit！ 啊，这倒可以上去。但是从这儿跳到那儿怎么可能？これ無理ですよ。啊 ！The star！ 我操 ！The stars！shit！ 啊，然后从这儿再过来是吧？我操！ Intentionally designing an art game.
I wanted it to be an art game, but unapologetically an art game, right? Because I've been thinking about art games and experimental games and all this stuff, and I was seeing that certain classes of things were not being made, right? Like,
but what does that mean? What does art game mean? Because it's one thing, you know, kind of. If I could bring it back to the Game Rants mailing list,
yeah,
where the aforementioned rewind mail came from. Another post that I made on that mailing list, I remember very clearly, was somehow in some discussion or something, someone may have used the word pretentious to describe something. And I literally wrote an email saying, I would love it if we were already at the point where I ever played anything that I would describe as pretentious. Because at that time, there was nothing that was even trying and failing to be an art game, let alone being an art game.
yes.
And so I feel like that you using that terminology is a little confusing for me, knowing what it was like at that time, because what did that even mean? Right?
Yes, I can definitely get more specific about it, right?
Yeah.
So I felt like if you look at another genre, like film or novels or whatever, the best art had a few.
这个肯定新的了，
Obviously, everything varies by genre, right? Every genre is a different thing. But there's some commonalities that I could observe. Like, the best art was not designed by a committee primarily for making money,
Right.
which is what the majority of the games industry was even at that time and what it was clearly heading toward, right? It had some stamp of the individual on it. Here is something that somebody cares about and maybe wishes to communicate or express. And even the word communicate is like kind of a red flag because it's very easy for people to misinterpret that, right? Back in grade school,
Yes.
in English class, you get taught this very formulaic thing about
yes,
how stories are, right?
Right.
Oh.
You read the story, and there's basically a secret message in the story that it's your job to understand and then write the 5-paragraph essay about like what that is.
Right. Yes.
That always felt too trivial to me. And as I had graduated to like college and beyond and found what do I really enjoy reading,
Yes.
right? It's just never that simple. Like there's stuff that people care about, but it's bigger than like hiding the marble in the oatmeal, right?
Right.
It's like
What is the green light at the end of the dock is not the whole point of the thing,
No.
right? Or whatever. Yeah.
No. And then in fact, all these things are complex and multidimensional. And I also saw that people were not really trying to even do that in games. Like,
Right,
where is
right.
the complex, multidimensional meaning in games?
Right.
And even for people who were making independent games, there was this struggle to be polished, right?
Right.
Like you're in India, you're doing some stuff, it looks crappy.
Right.
You want people to play it and not think it sucks. So you're spending all this time trying to make the bitmaps look nice, like
Right.
Nintendo makes them or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
And if you were that, imagine you're that as a person,
okay.
and you go to like dinner parties or something, and you're always like, I am exerting effort in everything I say and every move I make at this dinner party to present the most refined picture of myself so that I look as good as possible and so that everybody likes me as much as possible.
Okay.
I mean, on the one hand, everybody does a little of that. But on the other hand, that's kind of a psychopath. Like somebody who's never, that person is never going to become really good friends with anyone at the dinner party and like establish valuable relationships because they're not letting you see them.
Okay.
Right? And so there was some idea that all of this polish. So first of all, you're never going to compete with the AAA budgets. Even back then, the budgets were merely $20 or $30 million or whatever.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
So you're not going to compete with that on polish. So what are you doing? And why, as an indie, you should be trying to A, realize what you can't really do. So don't try and do that.
Don't try to do
but
that.
B, again, like with the EGW manifesto, realize what you are in a tactical position to do that the greater amount of money prevents those players from doing, right?
I see.
And that involves having a personal viewpoint. It involves having things be imperfect. It involves like, this looks a little sloppy, but it's expressive in a way that you won't see out of things that are polished all to heck, right?
That's very interesting. So in some sense, you are saying two things that are, it's the same conclusion, but from two totally different perspectives. One is that you would like there to be this kind of game because there is this kind of thing in other medium and there should be in this one.
Yes.
And the other is that actually this makes business sense. Like if you think of yourself as you're going to survive as an indie and make a bunch of games, if your whole thing is just like trying to be as close to AAA as possible, you're kind of always probably going to fail to a certain extent because it's just going to keep getting worse for you. So why not stake out a place they can't go?
Well, it definitely makes business sense, and I would tell that to people all the time. But it also just makes creative sense. Like if you want to contribute to the form, you can't do it by competing with AAA. Like that doesn't make sense, right? But you can do it by going in a different direction that you are set up to succeed in. And so that's a case where creative incentives and financial incentives overlap, which is actually a very valuable territory because that's the space in which artists can survive while having integrity, which is something that our culture doesn't understand to this day. Like you'll see all these people who say they're artists, but then they compromise what they're doing to make money, constantly. And the idea here was like, I think I see a space where I can do something that some people will want to buy and play. If they don't, great, I still made something cool. But that I don't have to be compromising to try and do that.
有个性不妥协嘛。这个例子，如果你拿 RPG 的点数来加，就更加简单了。你作为一个独立的小工作室，你的资金，你在 RPG 里面相当于你只有50个技能点数，而这帮3A 大厂是1000点。如果有5个维度、6个维度，那他们完全可以做成一个6边形，正5边形、正6边形，没有什么弱点，每方面都是8、9分。但你只有50点，那么你只能把这50点尽可能的加到1个、2个、3个地方，甚至就加了1个地方。那别的地方肯定是比较烂，你不可能有那么多时间精力，有这个资金去把这个游戏做得很完美，做成正5边形，做成没有什么缺点。而如果你真的要这么搞，真的要拿你这个50个点去搞一个5边形的话，那就什么都不行，要么就是每个地方都是2、3分，那个真的就是 crap game。所以 indie game 要有 indie game 的这个角度。如果说你的点数多了，那么你就要考虑问题。如果你只有50点，那么其实你没什么东西可以选。但如果你做了一次成功，突然你有这个200、300点了，虽然你还是没有这些3A 大作的大厂的1000点的这种点数，但是你可能会考虑你能不能想成做成这种正5边形、正6边形来去盈利，然后放弃自己原本当你只有50点的时候你那种做游戏的想法。这个就是一个妥协嘛，也没有什么对跟错，不同的 独立厂商，在获得一次小成功之后做的选择都不一样。有些呢依然走原来路线，有些呢可能就觉得现在你已经成功了，那么是不是应该效仿一下大厂？考虑一些什么商业盈利？这里就是之前提到的 personal game 跟 professional game。所以一般来说，做第一作这些独立的小工作室一般是比较和谐的。当你完成了第一作之后，这个团体里面一定会有分歧的，就有人想往东走，有人想往西走，自然而然会出现一些这个矛盾的问题。关键是看你怎么想。如果大家都是朝一个方向走，可能还行，因为没有什么对跟错的，完全是个人选择。The desire to expand games as a form of art.
The whole time since I got into the game industry,
把这行看完。
there was this ongoing discussion in the background, like, are games an art form?
这里的 art 应该是艺术，
And
不
there
是
are
美
lots
术
of。people who would say, oh, they totally are
Right,
because X,
yeah.
Y, and Z. But I would look at it and be like, you're telling me because of story or whatever, but the stories suck compared to movies and books. At
Yeah.
least the ones that I know.
Yeah.
So like,
这倒没说错，
really?
因为大多
And
数
so
游
there's
戏
this
的
question
剧
for
情
me
是
is like,
craft。
how are games a good art form? What can you do in them that is special to games, right? You look at films have cinematography.
对的
You don't have that in a stage play, right?
，right。
Which is how film started, is just setting up a camera and filming a stage play, right? You don't really have cinematography in a book, although you maybe have something a little bit analogous to it, but it works and feels
Different.
very differently, right?
Yeah.
And so,
What about games？
well, what about games? And
Interplay.
people had their pat answer even back then. It's like, oh, it's the
对的
interactivity.
，interactivity。
Okay, but what about it? Right?
Right.
Like if you start talking about cinematography, you can break that down into a ton of different techniques.
Yeah.
Right? Some of which are so basic they go in the script, right? Establishing shot is
Right.
in the script.
Yes.
What's the establishing shot of interactivity, right? What's
Right.
the, list out the 37 different things and tell me what they are, and nobody really had an answer for that. And
Yeah.
so I was interested.
这个问题还挺深刻的。
okay, what is that? Can I make a contribution to that? Can I figure out what some of these things are? And I'm not sure to what degree Braid specifically did that. It probably did a little bit, but it's also like that's the territory I was trying to mine for EGW
Right.
and all this stuff.
这个也是一些现在平民的3A游戏经常犯的一些问题，就把这个游戏搞得跟电影一样，就所谓的懒人游戏。你进了这个，打开这个 software， 进去了20-30个小时，然后你发现你根本就没有几个小时在打啊。当然我说的是个别，大多数还是需要一些这个 interplay， 因为这才是能体现出的游戏。纯粹是画面精美，搞得跟在看电影一样，那最后跟电影相比有什么区别呢？就明明称自己是一款游戏，但其实是电影，因为你根本就没有什么操作性，感觉就在那边不停的看一段事先录好的视频，这个就很蠢。The desire to make the visuals more expressive.
I was very deliberate though about this is an art game. That means it's expressive.
不是
That
expensive,
means
expressive.
The art style, whatever it is in the end, is not going to be very cookie cutter.
Cookie
It's
cutter.
not going to be a bunch of tiles that look the same. It's going to be like analog. It's going to be brush strokes from a paintbrush or something, because
Right.
that in the medium of painting, what makes a painting, it's not just that like paint came out of a brush, right? It's that was used
Yeah.
in ways that took a good deal of skill and refinement to figure out, here are the things we can do with a paint coming out of a brush. And you can look at that example created by painters and see what they did. And there's a challenge again in games. Maybe we want to start using that. We're at a time when graphics are better. We can afford to do this. It doesn't have to be a bunch of little tiles yet. You see people maybe still doing a bunch of tiles. Okay, let's get some more expressivity in there. I don't want to copy painting, but I want to try and use that channel better. With audio, platformers typically had 1 minute, 2 minute long little
Repetitive.
repeating themes because that's what would fit in memory on a Nintendo.
Mm-hmm.
And then people just copied that. And like, why don't I have a song that's more analog? It's just like it's sampled. I like cellos. Let's put some cellos in this game, right?
Okay.
Let's have them be longer and
我
more
还以为那个是小提
complex.
琴。
Because we can, and because that's helps me build a feeling that is not the generic mascot platformer feeling, right?
Right.
That's a thing that everybody was familiar with at the time.
有想法，但是话痨是真的。 他的话很多这个1分钟基本上可以拿10秒钟来概括，所以经常在他一个人讨论的时候很容易岔开去讲。当他是2人对话的时候，经常另外一个人会总结性的。我觉得我听懂了啊，你想表达的是这么2个意思，2句话就能说完，但把他2分钟的话总结了一下，经常会出现这种情况。Intentionally pushing against the tradition of polished mascot platformers， 所以这个我觉得不太像是常见的 commentary， 还是有点太啰嗦了，不够精简。这个地方没有 polish。
Oh, this is Ratchet over here, and then this game. What's the Insomniac or that is
Crash
Ratchet
Bandicoot?
Crash
像是
Bandicoot.
闲
whatever.
谈。
Blinks the Time Sweeper is a mascot platformer with Rewind that I
Yes.
think came out after I had started Braid or maybe slightly before.
I think it may have came out during Braid production. Yeah.
Certainly well before Braid was done. And all of these games are kind of trying to do the same thing. They're polished, they're designed by committee to make money by living in this aesthetic zone of the mascot platformer that is well understood, appeals to kids.
Yep.
Adults can still play it. You can sell toys
Yeah.
based on the mascot, and
Right.
you can make a franchise out of it.
Right.
So walk away from all of those bullet points, and where do you end up? Right? You can actually use those as points in space, and instead of an attractor field, put a repeller field on it.
Right. Just don't go anywhere near
Yeah.
where that would be.
Now the
Yeah.
problem is, without an attractor point somewhere, what that ends up being is repelling you arbitrarily out into space
Yes.
in all directions.
Right.
So you have to have attractor points.
Yes.
But if those are my repeller points and I have other attractor points, personal,
Yes.
uses this idea of weird physics as an analog to human scale paradoxes of existence, based around the mechanic, has this inverse illustrated storybook. Like all these ideas were things that I wanted to do, and so I had the things I wanted to do and the things I didn't want to do, and that together was enough. That still isn't a concrete game idea, but it was enough to create some field that I could navigate very easily.
Why some art games are too blunt about what they are saying? Blunt.
Is Trinity at all a touch point here? Because when I said I wouldn't even know what art game was, and I said I wrote that Game Rants thing, I had never played Trinity. And I'm pretty sure that if I thought pretty hard about it, I really wouldn't find anything else. But that game does kind of stand out, and you have referenced it, so I'll quickly ask, is that at all in your mind on this one, or is that more a Witness thing later on? Like are you thinking of like, oh wait, no, I do know there was an art game once a long time ago or something, or did you kind of have forgotten about it at this point and it comes back up later?
Well, no, I feel like there were several art games in the 80s.
Oh really?
Well,
1980.
Trinity was the one that meant the most to me. Like, it was my exemplar of an art game.
Okay.
Like, it can use fiction as a model
Mm-hmm.
for how to do this thing that you're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
of having realizations take place in your mind
Mm-hmm.
and not on the screen, right? So there are very well chosen things in that game,
Mhm.
just these elements around
Mhm.
the game, like what's in the world and what do you deal with and
Mhm.
under what circumstances,
Mhm.
right? And that's along the lines, like some of the meaning that is evident there is along the lines of the kind of thing that you would learn badly in English class or whatever,
Mhm.
but it's
Mhm.
like the better version of
Mhm.
it, right?
Mhm.
And the game never says, hey, did you get it?
Right.
By the way,
Yeah.
this thing means that.
Yes.
Firstly,
Yes.
I mean, I don't want to speak for him, but at least for two reasons,
Mhm.
right? One reason is because that removes agency from you, and it removes, even if you don't get it the first time, part of replayability is that you can go back to something and get something new out of it. And if I just like told you the thing, firstly, it prevents you from having that experience of getting the new thing, but secondly, you get an inferior realization of it. And because these things are complex and subtle and multidimensional, and when there are just elements and it's your job to build the connective tissue between them in your mind,
Yes.
that connective tissue can be quite delicate, and
Right.
you may not even know how to put it into words, And in fact, the author may not know how to put it into words without
Right.
messing it up or making it more coarse or destroying it.
Right.
And that is really, there's this idea of fine art, right? And I
Right.
feel like that's part of fine art is it's not just skill, but there's something there that you can say that it's not just that you're choosing to say it in this medium, it's that you couldn't say it not in the medium.
Yes.
And Trinity has that, and very few games have that.
Yes.
Yeah, and maybe all that's left to say about that is that I've had some picture the whole time, and I don't know if I realized this was directly from Trinity. I think I just knew that Trinity was this really good art game that I
Yeah.
enjoyed. But I've, for way longer than I've been in games, like back when I wrote fiction and stuff, I definitely had this aesthetic of there are things I'm trying to get at, they're hard to express,
Yes.
and so you maybe express them by demarcating the space around them to sort of make the negative space image or the silhouette of them or something, and then people can pattern match on that and
Right.
and get something out of it that they wouldn't be able to get if you just clumsily scribbled it in crayon.
Right.
I am not a practitioner of Zen, but there's a Zen parable. It's like someone's going to the master and asking for enlightenment,
Mm-hmm.
and he keeps pointing at the moon,
Okay.
right? And the guy's like, so what? What's so special about your finger, right? 'Cause he keeps looking at the finger,
I
right?
see.
Where the job of the finger is to indicate something far away,
I see.
right? And the less of a finger you put, the less likely somebody is gonna like fixate on that.
On the finger. Okay.
Now that said, the atomic bomb stuff in Braid is a very
Yes.
strong signal that many people fixate on. And
Yeah.
had I realized how strong that fixation would be, I might have tuned it differently.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, for my first big, like, trying to be an art game, right? All these previous projects we talked about were not trying to be this kind of art.
Right.
And it's interesting that it took me a while to get there, but when I get there, I already knew what I was doing. So
Yeah.
obviously this had been percolating for a long time, but
Yeah.
like Wolfram was not an art game in this way. It was just like, I'm going to try and have smart game design
Right.
and do a challenging technical thing. But that example of Trinity rode with me the whole time and came out later, 20 years later or whatever.
紧张。Grip。哇哦。嚯，这是干嘛呢 ？What？诶？这关还挺复杂啊，这个也过去了。我操！啊，他是能过去，我是回不去。这不是必死无疑了吗？这有什么意义吗 ？Grip， 这关怎么这么压抑啊？这肯定来不及嘞，还能活？有这么多只吗？直接死！什么东西啊？好变态的关啊！時間的に間に合うね。 啊，对啊，先往那儿走是吧？我操！야, 마녀네, 마녀네. 예술을 무리잖아. 只要你把一只放进去了就不行了。これはもう無理ですね。Shit！ 哦，还没完啊！我操，我还以为已经那个了。啊，这可能完蛋了。哇！マジで遅いな。走了，我操！That's fucking crazy. Cassie Muratori, Chris Moore， 这个应该不算长啊，相比而言，这 Muratori 下一期肯定搞不定。Yes， ここまであれじゃないな。啊，在这里很多都已经看过了。直接走是吗？不要等。哦，这儿。 操，这也不小哎。This is too long, man. 啊，这边很多都已经看过了，是吧？我根本不知道他说的什么东西。啊，然后这里最里面，我要打嘛，肯定从最里面开始。这儿。啊，它是这么一个圈是吧？怪不得。现在这样已经几片了？9片了是吧？9片是9片，但剩下还有一大片区域，可不可以任务已经一半了？27能搞定，我觉得已经很不容易了。这个的话，1分10来秒就行了。玩一次，我估计成绩应该不会太好。差不多要等到10秒钟是吧？没卡好，这还没减慢。不是不可以，但肯定难，稍微难度大了点。这要连续2次。可以了，稍微岔开一会儿就可以了。This is the best solution you can ever get. 这个起码等级是5，这2就没办法了。啊，这个地方刚好等一下。Which is very bad, you know. Shit. 啊，这里1分16了，这么慢。我操，还有这种问题？超时了，不会吧？给控制的。可以了。每次我都觉得我的时间偏长了。Nice。啊，1分18吗？1分17秒77，怎么样 ？How was it？ 1分18秒90，就这样，这个应该可以了。然后就差最后那一段了。 那就没什么茶余饭后的娱乐活动。这搞的哪个死给讲的？第9期是吧？Design 守5期吧，争取守5期结束。先立个 flag。